soil is very, very important. We grow our food in it, so we can't afford to run out of it. You know, you've got people like World Health Organization talking about soil running out, arable land running out by the year 2050. So it's all pretty alarmist, scary stuff. And most people I know are looking to rebuild their farms, because I call most farms I see around Australia is what I call legacy farms. They're not the forest that you got, chopped down the trees and then managed it. We've had it, numerous owners, trees chopped down, replanted, paddocks changed. And we've changed the face of the country in many ways. That bottom right-hand black and white photo there with that person standing under the root, that's a big river red gum. Now that's lost soil. That's metres and metres of soil. That's either been removed by wind or water over all these times. Again, annual crop value due to just by salt, $27 billion. So it is expensive. We are in the 21st century where we're starting to understand that we have to work more with country, work more with nature. Which got me thinking about, well, what happened centuries ago, you know, when there were bugger all people on the planet and we all lived on these little alluvial floodplains in paradise. And then by the time we came around in the 1400s, we've set up our arable land in the UK and places that, you know, we're aware of. But there's this book in 1523 called the Book of Husbandry, and it's just a comment of that if you walk on your land and it nor singe or cry or make any noise under thy feet, then it is too wet to sow. If it make no noise and will bear thy horses, then sow in the name of God. So it's a very simple concept that even back then we were looking for this connection between how we treat our soil, what we're growing into, and how it works. And the term that they used was soil tilth. It's a very, very old term. It sort of stretches into tillage, which is turning over the soil. So soil tilth and soil health, to me, are two completely different things. We talk about soil quality and soil health in the current day, but we still don't have a real handle on that. If you grow chrysanthemums, your soil health and your soil quality is going to be different to someone who's growing wheat out in South Australia and these sorts of things. So the whole concept of soil tilth, and the author Carlin said that while we have this long history of intriguing people because of its connection with the soil, the concept confuses scientists because of their inability to provide an exact definition. And that is true. Soil is quite a hazy science. So when we talk about soil tilth, it's mainly associated with the soil's physical properties and how water moves through it and the sort of things that, as farmers, we see on our land from day to day. Now, I'll zip through this quite quickly without going into the detail of how we came up with, we've had some Russian scientists back in the 40s and 50s who started trying to name soils around the world. We had in Australia North Cape Factual Key back in the 70s and 80s. And then since the early 90s, we've come up with this Australian soil classification system. Now, it is based on the soil profile, it's based on horizons, it's based on the texture between the A and B horizon, it's the boundary layer, so they can be diffuse, which is something like that and that, or it can be quite well defined with something like that, which is a curasol. And as you can see, they're all different colours, they've all formed in different places, and again, parent material, climate, time, and topography all contribute to these soils. The one thing you'll notice when you drive around too, just before I go through the profiles, is if you look close enough and you drive up and down the coast, you can physically see the change in vegetation, whether you're moving away from the coast, from the sandy soils, up into the mountains, the back of Wootton. In fact, Wootton to the coast is a very good drive for just that. You can see slight changes in the vegetation. The vegetation is in dynamic equilibrium with the soil that it's growing in. So you can, old forestry guys used to tell me that that's how they would tell a soil, how the soil was changing, because the trees would be different. Simple as that. So there must be a method to the madness of why these trees, apart from the rainfall and nice and healthy, about why certain species grow in certain soils. And again, that's the whole point of native vegetation in countries all around the world. Now, I won't spend too much time on this, but anthroposols are basically soils that, if you went down to Newcastle, the Waste Management Centre, and took a core out of the landfill, that's what we'd call an anthroposol. It's a soil that we've made, we've packed it, the side of a road, completely modified. And highly leached and mottled, so a lot of the water's moving through, there's iron leaching through and gets all those lovely patterns. So the organosols, again, quite rare, inundated with water, and again, there's thresholds of what makes this an organosol, and then if it's not an organosol, it becomes a podosol. And a BS, BHS or BS, a BS is the sesquioxide oxide layer, which is just like an iron colour to it. H is a humic layer, and you can have H and S together. And as you can see there, you get the, typically leaching through the A horizon, a build-up of the leached materials, typically a lot of iron in Australia. So, and they give you these soil profiles, and that one in there is called a podosol. You can see from the map that, well, it's hard to, pardon me, to see exactly where they are, but podosols don't exist very much, And again, this is a soil classification system that if you went out into the field, took a sample or dug a pit and got a profile like this, you should be able to put it into one of these classifications. Vertisols, these are a little bit more common. This is what you expect to see out in Narrabri. So these soils, when they dry out, they crack, huge cracks in them. But when the rain comes, the water gets to move down deep quite quickly because of the crack. And then once it's moist again, the clay swells up and shuts the crack. That's why you get these little fingers of leaching and of calcium and other things moving through the soil. And then Coonawarra, the grapes love it. Hydrosols, again, you've got this A and B horizon, one almost completely inundated, permanently wet. A few of those around the place. And interesting, some of these are actually out in the middle of the desert as well. I've yet to see one, but I find it quite interesting that, like glaciers in Papua New Guinea, they do exist. So yeah, now this is down in South Australia. That's what you'd kind of be looking for. So you'd have this perched water table, and everything along the edge of that would be completely inundated, and quite often anoxic as well. So it's not it's not breathing. So we want air to move through the soil as well, which means if it's permanently saturated, air's not getting in, so it needs to wet and dry, and that's where a lot of our agricultural soils are very good. Curasols, again, these are very common, what we find around here, so this is what we're looking at. They can have different, so if you went to depth, you would find that it'd be mottled, you'd have the iron being drawn through, quite gravelly in areas, particularly on top of the hills. If you run the yeoman plough around many of the properties around here, you will hit lots of rocks. It's just the nature of these soils. With a strongly acid B horizon, so these are pH less than 5.5. And as you can see, all along the east coast of Australia there, and right about here is where we are. So we've got a good little patch of curasols. Tamarumba, sodasols, these ones obviously have a lot more sodium in them, and I'll talk a little about cation exchange and the balance within a clay particle soon. But when you've got a lot of sodium in the soil, typically your pH is going to be higher as well. So it's typically above 7. And that's important itself, because if the pH is above 7, the mobility of micronutrients like copper, zinc, boron and all these other things that we've discussed before don't mobilise as quickly. So the idea is to have a soil pH around 5.56. It seems to me to be ideal. And sodasols, as you can see, we're a dry country. Lots of salty soils out there. And again, there are thresholds for exchangeable sodium percentage and how these sort of affect, but I'm going to talk about that soon. Chromosols, this is another common one around this part of the world. So they're not strongly acid or sodic, so they're like a curasol, except the pH is a little bit higher. Calcaresols, now these are ones that have a whole lot of calcium in them, and now they're from carbonate accumulations like old coral reefs and stuff like that, rather than just weathered limestone or shells from beaches. And as you can see, Great Australian Bight, a lot of limestone down that part of the world. If you've been along the Great Ocean Road and you get up there near the 12 Apostles and Lockhart Gorge and you manage to walk down the steps to the beach, you can see the actual limestone layers in between the other geology, and the water's moving through it and actually forms little stalactites along the edge of the thing. It's quite well, I'm a geek, so it's pretty exciting for me. Space in there, and again, so this is typical of your wheat belts. So they grow well in the in the limestone. Ferrosols, you've seen these all over the place. Every time you drive up to Barrington Tops or up any hill slope, see the road cutting. I was actually at Barrington Tops last weekend, and all the red slopes as you're driving up to the top, they just slumped and covered the road, so the road was closed. Another exciting weekend for me. But yeah, so iron is the major component of a ferrosol, of course. Dermasols, so soils with the structured B horizon, but the texture doesn't change through the soil as well, which is interesting. They're usually a deeper soils. Plenty of vegetation there. Candasols, again, I'll go through these because you can all look this up on the internet. Just put in Australian Soil Classification System, and then it gives you a little hierarchy, and you can click through and create all your different groups. Rutasols, again, we're talking about pedological organisation, so that's the PEDs, the little clumps of soil when you dig it up that you can feel in your hands and break up. Apedal or weakly structured, so we're looking at, again, the physical properties of soil to classify them rather than, their nutrient capacity or, their ability to be compacted and turned into a road or whatever. Tenosols, they're basically one of the last, and you can see they're the majority of soils in Australia where we've gone to all this trouble to classify soils and all these other classifications, and if any soil doesn't fit into any of those, we call it a tenosol. And as you can see, there's lots of those all around the place. And here's an example of how, when we're out in the field, this is from up at Gloucester during the coal seam gas irrigation water project a few years back. We go up on site, we get the excavator, we dig this hole. You can see there that we've got, an A and B horizon, which we can define. And this is what we call a simple soil pit test. And from this, we take all our soil samples out of this pit and then send them off to the laboratory. So we have the full chemistry and everything going with it as well. But from a physical perspective, you get in, you get your hands dirty, you work out the texture, you see if there's any worms present, you comment on the boundary, whether it's sharp or diffuse. And in this case, it's diffuse because it's not a straight line. It's sort of something that merges, it becomes more of a hazy line. You talk about the roots, you talk about colour and all these sorts of things. And then when you go to put into a classification, you get, effectively the output is something similar to a barcode. So if you had a soil and that was the soil classification, a soil scientist should be able to look at that, refer to the classification and in his mind, have an understanding of what that soil should be in terms of its, whether it's clay, loamy, gravel, what's the A horizon thickness and all these sorts of things. So it does give you a lot of information in a tiny little word, and that's how, or tiny little code. And that's where we're at with soil classification in Australia. It's probably one of the best in the world, to be honest. It covers most of Australian soils, and it's a good first principle place to start. But in the soil's made up of sand, silt and clay, as you know, and the more clay you've got, the more chances this sort of response and behaviour will happen. So what we're looking at here is a series of clay domains. So a clay particle, if you just picture it like a dinner plate, they're actually negative and positively charged. So the positive bits at the end will, because everything's looking to repel and attract at the same time. So instead of sitting above each other, they sort of sit offset. So these are the domains. So in amongst these tiny little micropores in the soil, you've got organic polymers, you've got bacteria, you've got sand grains, you've got a whole little microcosm of things happening in there. And in amongst those, you've got the exchangeable cations, which is your calcium, your sodium, magnesium and potassium. Now calcium has a charge of 2+, sodium has a 1+ charge. So we're talking about Coulomb's forces, we're talking electrostatic forces within these little microcosms. So how does it all work? Well, once you start putting water in there, a clay will actually naturally swell up. If the clay is full, and this is why you lime your soil. because these are your micropores. If you've got the calcium in there, it's 2+, so there's a greater charge that's holding the platelets closer together, and the pore size is actually much greater than when it's dominated by the sodium. So this is all diffuse double layer theory. It's not super complicated, and this came about, well, work I did with effluent irrigated woodlots. So if you've got a wastewater that you want to irrigate onto something, the chances are it's going to increase in sodium over time rather than just putting rainwater on to a crop all the time. So these are sort of probably more geared towards an irrigated crop rather than natural crops. But if you've got a sodic soil and you get fresh rainfall, quite often you'll get this dispersion which will break the clay particles up into little plates, and they will slip down within these pores and will actually block certain pores and will slow down the rate at which water will move through to the deep part of the soil profile. How does it work? Well, there's a thing called an Emerson Aggregation Test. If you take a little soil ped, and you know, when we're out with Lee later on, we'll hopefully find a few, but your little petri dish, you put it in there with some water, and if it's like that, you say that your soil's relatively stable, and which is good, that's what you want. If it's like this, it means that as soon as it rains, your soil's just going to completely disperse. Now, when that soil disperses and dries out, and the wind gets up, away it blows. If the rain has any sort of, drainage line or anything, it just picks that up and moves it, and that's when you see all the rivers and creeks and streams look like chocolate milk. You know, that's the sort of things that's happening. We're getting dispersion processes up within catchments, mainly in disturbed and cleared areas, and it's creating this sort of thing. On the farm, highly dispersive soils are problematic because you don't get water passing through them, and I don't see too many salinity issues on the coast with when it comes to well, you do get dispersion, but not so much from an accumulated salinity, which you do get out west. And of course, they all have these little patterns. One thing this is called the sodium absorption ratio, which is more or less a ratio of, how much sodium compared to the other cations in solution. So this is the water that's, moving on to the soil. The electrical conductivity is your saltiness of your soil, if you like. You can measure that. Ideally, you're looking at, so at the moment, rainfall would have a very low SAR because it's low in calcium and sodium. Well, has more sodium close to the coast for that matter. But you can see this line here. So if your soil is 0.2 decisiemens per metre, you're actually right on the cusp of having soil structural problems or being quite stable. And what guides that line is this continuum where, we talk about you have soil of a known structure. If you start increasing the sodium, so if you start increasing this curve or increasing this factor, you start moving the continuum up towards here. And you'll get to a point where you'll have a threshold concentration, and that's when all the clay particles are just stuck together. It's like cleaning your pool. If you've got a cloudy pool, you throw the flocculant in and the charge brings all the bits together and it drops out, and then you sweep it all up and that becomes, you suddenly cleaned up your water. The same thing's happening here in all these little micro soil pores within the soil profile. Same if you drive it the other way, so this is more like rainfall. So as your soil's increasing in sodium and you start getting more rainfall, you start driving the continuum back down towards dispersion where you're breaking them all up again. So you're getting that cloudy particles floating in the water, they won't settle out. So water will move your soil away, the wind will blow it away when it dries out. And again, just the behaviour and response of soils with respect to clay particles. But the exciting part of all of this is we've spoken about the physical properties, we've spoken about climate, and we know it's changing, things get wetter, hotter, drier, colder, hopefully not more freezing. But if we look at the organomineral complexes within, a plant root, the mycorrhizal fungi and the hyphae that they give out. The hyphae generates glomalin, which helps stabilise the microaggregates. So they all contribute to the soil stability outside of the cation exchange. So we have these little biological communities that work together with the plant. And in here there's lots of things going on here. But basically the microbes can trap water within soil pores. And this is more like the engine of what's driving crop productivity, in my word, when I was talking about truffles. We know that there's some people down at Braidwood in the Southern Highlands that grow the truffles. The science behind the type of tree you need, the fungi that resides there to create the truffle is quite well known. So the idea of thinking outside that square as well, how can we apply that same relationship between the bacteria in the soil, what we're growing, and soil tilth or quality, depending on what we're looking at. And this is a relatively new field of research, which I said I'm pretty excited about, and hopefully over the next few years we'll get to do a lot of work like this around this area. So the soil microbial processes, we've got some grass, we've got some roots. We can start off with the bacteria here. So the bacteria, and they, like beavers in a dam, they just block all the holes to keep the water in because they don't want it to dry out. So this little community starts creating this water retention, which is land hydration, by the way, on a microscopic level, which Rod will be talking about a bit later. The growth of these bacteria, they're not all one bacteria, there's a whole population of them. It's like Lord of the Rings all coming together, all the 5 armies. And they all have different sensitivities to heat and water, and they all live and they die. So when they live, they're taking up carbon, which they get from the tree or the plant. When they die, they leave a necromass, a dead mass there, which is carbon sequestration on the smaller scale. And the plant growth, so you get these, plant hormones which assist the plant, they fixate nitrogen, and generally, because the opposite to this is, as I said, a large monoculture wheat farm out in the middle of Australia where none of these things happen. Everything is dead in the soil. They manage everything through fertiliser inputs, fungicides, just to get the yield that they require. And I think we've all now learnt that we can't keep going on that way, treating our soil like that. We've lost a lot of it, and this is how spectacular it can be. And this is from a very recent paper out of Nature, which is one of the top journal articles you can get, top journals you can buy. And what we're looking at here, without going into the detail, we've got hyphae, which comes from your mycorrhizal fungi. We've got different types of, protozoas, amoeba, bacteria, in a state. And then what we're saying here is if we apply fire, we have an atmosphere with higher CO2, or we increase the temperature, we freeze it, we're into drought, or we have increased precipitation or seawater intrusion. So all of these impact a soil. So, if we have an elevated, the soil organic carbon is what this represents here. So when you're decreasing the soil organic carbon or increasing the soil organic carbon, I'm not going to go into all the functions, but as you can see that population shifts to different ones, loses the hyphae through fire, and that's because the soil microbes of the population has shifted. It's like being invaded. So the fire has an impact on the soil microbiome. Seawater intrusion has the same thing. So both fire and seawater intrusion are carbon sequestration processes in the soil. I'm not suggesting we go around and light up your farm every 12 months to increase the soil carbon, but in the new blue carbon funding through the government at the moment, places like Greg's Place and Brian's Place and Rod's Place, where we've got these wetlands now, where in the past we've blocked off the salt water to allow your land to have your livestock on. Now with the 21st century, we've fenced off all that land, allowing the wetlands to come back and regenerate. But the idea might be now to open it back up to the salt water. So because the cows aren't in there, we can look at the mangroves and the salt marsh areas, and these soils are completely different, compared to an agricultural farming soil. But this is the sort of things that we're talking about that we can relate by measuring the bacteria in these soils. So again, it's a very exciting field, lots to discuss, and this is hopefully what we'll be doing over the next couple of years. So why is this soil metagenome analysis important, and why would we want to know anyway? And if we look at the current state, this is what we've got. Every single one of these represents, a different something in the soil. In 1 square centimetre of soil, there is 1 times 10 to the 15 organisms. So that's 1 with 15 zeros onto it. That's what we're looking in 1 little square centimetre of soil. And my simple brain says to me, well, if you look at a rainforest soil, and you look at what grows in it and what the soil's like, people say, oh yeah, I'd like a couple of buckets of that soil to come and put on the garden. And I have a bit of a chuckle because rainforest soil isn't very nutritious. It's just the rainforest is so well at cycling these nutrients that there really is nothing in the soil. It relies on the detritus falling from the trees and the animals and everything else, everything connecting. And most importantly, it relies on the nematodes and worms and fungi and all these other things that help decompose. So the decomposers in a rainforest play a major role. In the soil as well, we have a similar thing. So you have to conceptualise what's happening in a rainforest and how can we replicate that on our farm, even though it's not a rainforest. But we want the same populations. So all of these different bugs, all of these different things, they're all connected. They all connect with those ones, different processes. They have these energy cycles, they transfer protons, there's a whole heap of biochemical reactions that go on, which more often than not create these glomalin and these, these organic polymeric substances that can really contribute to soil structure and enhance its ability against any climate change in the future. So if you've got a dead soil, nothing living in it, it doesn't matter whether you fire, freeze it, irrigate it, whatever, it'll never, ever, ever be a living soil. Whereas if we can understand what's in our soil and how it contributes to the function of what we're growing, well, I think it's a pretty exciting field to be in. So I'll finish off with this one. So how do we improve soil tilth and increase the bugs in our soil? Well, there's some very simple things that we can look at. Soil does need air, water and a high biodiversity of soil microbiome. The climate variability, and all of you will notice it around here that you go for a period, the soil dries out, you walk through your paddock, it's like walking on cornflakes, the skies open up, dumps down, most of it rushes off, and then you'd be lucky if water infiltrated that far into the soil. So it's almost like you just want these waves and waves and waves to keep saturating so you can increase that soil moisture. The nature of the soils and the ground cover that we have, with the lack of trees means that we, Rod talks about a duna, and we do. We have to create this quilt, this little duna to keep the water in the soil. And as I said, soil microbiome is the largest carbon sink in the world at the moment, other than algae that bloom in the ocean. So it's a very important factor within our soils, and the government's realising that, and they're going to hopefully pay farmers money if you can demonstrate that you're keeping a healthy soil microbiome. Simple as that. Big thing for me, I've done a lot of work on Norfolk Island where it's all those ferrosols, those red clays, a lot of them, very clay. Remove the grass, rain hits, and the whole thing washes away. That's how fragile it can become. So maintaining ground cover, increasing your organic matter, and all these sorts of things, because increasing your organic matter helps reduce that salinity, offsets the salinity, which relates back to the charge, because you're keeping your pH down. And again, you keep your pH down, you allow the plant more opportunity to uptake your micronutrients and phosphorus and these sorts of things. Minimise fertiliser application where possible, including chicken litter. Again, that's just my personal preference because much of Australia is very poor in phosphorus in the first place. All the vegetation doesn't really need a lot of phosphorus, but other things do. And if you've got a farm that's got nothing growing on it, I'm not going to, kick up a stink if someone wants to use chicken litter to bring it to a point with the aim of optimising pasture species and stock rotation or whatever people are doing on their farm at some stage down the track. But I'll leave it at that for the moment. Plenty to talk about down the track. We have put in a couple of soil extension programs through the National Land Care Program. Pardon me. And part of that program is going to be looking at several farms, going out there 4 or 5 times over 2 years, digging these soil pits, taking the samples, having the full chemistry, having the full physical and the full soil metagenome analysis, and then to sit down and say, well, what does all this mean? So a lot of my talk this week is leading into Friday's talk next week, where we've got all the soil data from Fred and from Andrew, and yeah, we can talk about what the data means, and we've got some soil metagenome data as well. So anyway, thank you very much.